Today is October 10th, and we're having Senator Black with us to talk about the conflicts in the Middle East and in Ukraine. Welcome back, Senator.
Well, thank you. It's good to be with you today.
And let's get started with what's going on right now between Iran and Israel. How do you find the situation right now, and how can we understand the behavior of Israel right now?
Well, uh, Benjamin Netanyahu has been determined to draw the United States directly into conflict with Iran. And uh, he has tried to sort of pretend that somehow Iran is coming after Israel and this sort of thing. Iran is focused on developing its economy, and the last thing in the world that they want is a war. And so, in order to provoke a conflict, Netanyahu has launched some very provocative attacks. Um, he's he's been trying to convince us for years to go into war against Iran, and so what he did, he just felt like I'm just going to go all in for this. I'm going to make it happen because it's very important now to get the United States involved now that Israel is attacking all of its neighbors, not all, but many of them. And so what he did is the Israelis bombed the Iranian consulate in Syria, something that I think most nations view as a violation of international law, uh, perhaps as a war crime. And I think he felt like if I do this, this is so outrageous and so confrontational that it will force Iran to respond with tremendous force. And then that will give me the excuse to cry out to the United States, look, we're being attacked by Iran. And it didn't work, um, partly because the Iranian government was very deliberative. They didn't act rashly. And, uh, and so Iran, has been compelled to take some action, but they sort of put it off. Well, the next thing, Netanyahu believed it is absolutely essential to get the United States drawn into this war. And so uh, at the time, there was the very top Hamas official who, Hamas being the group in the Gaza Strip that's involved in defending against the attack by Israel right now, and uh, so the head negotiator, the peace negotiator, who was trying to work out some arrangement between uh, Gaza and Israel, he was assassinated uh, right in the Iranian capital of Tehran. The purpose of it was, of course, to block any serious peace negotiations with Hamas. Netanyahu appears to have a plan to purge all of the Palestinians from the area that Israel claims, including the Gaza Strip, including the West Bank. And so that was one thing, is to block any serious attempts at peace in the Gaza Strip. The other thing was to draw Iran into the war. And again, by doing the most outrageous thing they could, which was to assassinate a visiting dignitary in broad daylight in the capital city of Iran. Um, Again, this didn't work. The United States has been very reticent to get drawn into this. Part of it is that the Biden administration does not want to have the United States deployed in a war in the Middle East right on the verge of the presidential election. So they have been reluctant to be drawn more deeply. Um, in any event, this goes back and forth. At some point, we don't know for sure what's going to happen. We don't know whether there will be the point reached where Israel just decides to go it alone and to launch an attack on Iran. I think they would much prefer to have the United States be the headliner for the attack, to where we're the ones who are going in, we're using all of our resources, and so that's where we stand right now.
Yeah. When you look at the behavior of Netanyahu and the way that he's talking about that we're winning, doesn't matter if Macron wants to help us or not, and how we can we understand the behavior, the mindset in Israel? I'm talking about Netanyahu and his administration, the way that they have been fighting in Gaza, and they couldn't bring the hostages home. And right now, they're in a new conflict in the southern part of Lebanon. They want to fight Hezbollah, which is bigger, which is much more powerful, especially on the ground. And they were fighting in Syria, in Iraq. They know how to fight on the ground. And how if when you look at this, what's your take on this?
Let me take just a minute to describe what Hezbollah is. Hezbollah is often presented as being this terrorist organization. The fact is that Hezbollah is a Shia Muslim political party, and the Islamic world is divided into the Sunnis and the Shia. Those are the two most important branches. And then there are variations, particularly among the Sunnis. There are very radical, extremely terroristic groups. Then they're very moderate Sunnis. But the Shia have a whole different philosophy. They tend to be, I think, if we looked at them honestly, they tend to be a more moderate branch of Islam. When we talk about suicide bombings, which has been a big concern during the so-called war on terror, suicide bombings are not condoned by the Shia Muslims. They consider it to be sinful to kill yourself in a suicide bombing. The Sunnis, particularly the radical Sunnis, accept suicide bombings as something that is desirable in the eyes of God. So the Shia are much more moderate group. In Lebanon is set up with what's called a confessional form of government. They recognize that they have considerable religious differences, and so the three major elements of the government are the Shia Muslims, the Sunni Muslims, and the Christians. And each of those has a major role in government. For example, the president of Lebanon is always a Christian. And so Hezbollah it's a political party. It's the political party of the Shia Muslims, but it is also a party that has a very powerful military capability. Now keep in mind that the current invasion of Lebanon by Israel is not the first. This is the fourth major invasion, and there's been border conflict almost incessantly since Israel began. And so Hezbollah, the political party, set up a military wing to act as a defensive army to defend the border between Lebanon and Israel. And this army is very, very effective. They are very highly disciplined, they're well armed, and they're very experienced. During the CIA directed terror attack on Syria, which began in 2011 under Barack Obama, when we began to flood weapons across the Turkish border into Syria, and we began to promote particularly Al-Qaeda in Syria, which went under the name of Al-Nusra at the time, and then they changed their name as they become associated with Al-Qaeda, which is the group that brought down the Twin Towers on 9/11 and triggering the war on terror. As people in the United States and in the West began to realize, well, wait a minute, these guys are freakishly terroristic, then they changed their names to something else. But they were organized by the CIA before the war broke out in Syria in 2011. They were armed by the Central Intelligence Agency, and their general scheme of action and attack was directed by the Central Intelligence Agency. And it was a very bloody, horrible terroristic attack on Syria that involved mass rapes, not as an incident of war, but as a policy. I'm not saying the CIA directed the policy of rape, but they set up an organization that they knew believed in this. This was, they had this notion that you can take women that you capture with your strong right arm and you can keep them, and not only women, but women and children. And the CIA-backed rebels set up slave markets in Syria where they bought and sold women and little girls. So I'm not saying the CIA set it up, but they set up this organization that did such things. But in any event, so in reaction to this horror that was taking place in Syria, Hezbollah came out of Lebanon. They sent elements of their forces and they sent them into battle alongside the legitimate Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad, and they fought the terrorists. They were very effective, and as time went on, and the Al-Qaeda and the ISIS elements that we supported, as they were defeated, we didn't always support ISIS. We had a love-hate relationship. We killed them. It depended on what was going on publicity-wise. But finally, Syria, Hezbollah, Iran, and Russia teamed up, and they drove the terrorist Al-Qaeda out. By the time that Al-Qaeda was driven back into a relatively small enclave in Idlib province of Syria, where they still hold it to this day. By this time, Hezbollah had become the world's most effective urban fighters of the time. And I can't tell you who is the most accomplished. It could be Ukrainians, it could be Russians, but certainly Hezbollah, if they are not the world's finest urban fighters, they are right up there, and they certainly are the finest urban fighters in the Middle East today. So that's who they are. Now, there have been propaganda campaigns to link Hezbollah with Al-Qaeda, as though somehow Hezbollah has some relationship where they're doing some deals with Al-Qaeda. This is the most absurd thing, and it's typical of the CIA directed propaganda campaigns, because they fought an enormous war against Al Qaeda in Syria, and so the very notion that here this this armed organization of Shia Muslims would somehow make a deal with the terror groups of the Sunni Muslims, who consider them to be apostates, is just so absurd that only in the world of CIA disinformation could you pull that off. But in any event, we have a situation where Israel has launched an invasion of Lebanon with 4 divisions. They've just recently added a 4th division, and they've done massive bombing strikes. They've killed enormous numbers of people, driven over 1 million people from their homes in Lebanon, where the Israelis ordered them to flee. And of course, the problem for the refugees is that often they'll flee to some place that Israel suggests is a safe haven, and then Israel just goes ahead and bombs them. Sometimes it's because there is somebody that they want to kill who's a member of perhaps of Hezbollah or whatever. But certainly these areas that the Israelis tell people to flee to are not protected zones, and they're still free fire zones for Israelis. So it's very, very painful for civilians who, they're not involved in deciding anything, and they just want their families, their children to be safe, and they can't escape from the Israeli bombings.
One of the reasons, do you want to add something?
No, go ahead.
Yeah. When we look at what Netanyahu is saying right now, he's saying that we are going to fight Hezbollah because we want to send our people to the northern part of Israel, to their homes in the northern part of Israel. That's why we are attacking Hezbollah. And do you think this is the only reason for them going into Lebanon, in the southern part of Lebanon, fighting Hezbollah, or there is something else behind?
Well, let me say first of all that one of the reasons that Israel is invading Lebanon is to make their areas safe for the Israelis who live close to the Lebanese border. There are about 96,000 Israelis who have been displaced. There are over 1 million Lebanese who have been displaced. But that certainly is one reason. I think beyond it, you have to go back to 2006, which was the last major invasion that Israel launched against Lebanon. At that time, the Israeli government had become very distracted. They were not focused on the campaign in Lebanon. They sent their troops, who were very ill prepared, into Lebanon, and they even failed to send them adequate water and things like that. And the troops got into Lebanon, and they were met by Hezbollah, and it turned out to be a very, very bitter confrontation. They lost a lot of troops. Of course, they killed a lot of Lebanese, a lot of members of Hezbollah. But in any event, it just became too expensive for Lebanon, or for Israel rather, to continue the attack. And so they withdrew in a fairly short order. It was just a matter of months. And it was a rather humiliating defeat for Israel. It was never presented in the Western press as being a victory for Hezbollah. And you could argue, who won, who didn't win, but for Hezbollah, which is the Lebanese defense force, they defended the border, and in that sense, they won, and Israel lost. But I think there is a long-standing desire by Israel to expand its borders. They managed to seize the Golan Heights from Syria. They maintain an occupation force there, and they managed to seize lands from other countries, Egypt and so forth. I think they particularly are interested in seizing the land of Lebanon. Lebanon has some very good seacoast ports and so forth, and also there are gas fields in the area that Israel is beginning to exploit, and so there's just a desire for expansion room, living space, as what the Germans used to call it during when they launched their war against the Soviet Union, and talked about Lebensraum. I think it was pronounced the living space for the German people. I think it's been a long-standing notion that Israel needs to expand its borders, needs to force the Arab populations from the areas where they are the indigenous people, and yield ground to the Israeli people.
Senator, when you look at the policy in the Middle East, there is a discussion right now between many of analysts that they're talking about is the tail wagging the dog or the dog wagging the tail in the Middle East, dog and tail, the United States and Israel. And in your opinion, who's running the show in the Middle East?
Israel. Israel is totally in charge of what goes on in the Middle East, and there was an interesting article within the last couple of years that talked about the tremendous portion of political donations to both the Democrats and to the Republicans by people who were represented large Jewish interests, and it may have been Haaretz, I'm not sure, but it's a prominent Israeli publication that said that over half of the Democratic contributions come from these interests, and as I recall, it was something more like a third of the Republican contributions. So you have this very, very uncomfortable situation where, particularly at election time, the two political parties are engaged in this game of one-upsmanship to say, well, I am more pro-Israel than you are, vice versa. You see that going on right now, and to say that it's the tail wagging the dog absolutely is. Israel is certainly the most powerful political lobby in Washington, and they count for more than all of the other overseas lobbying interests combined, I suspect. And so it's not that Netanyahu can simply command these things, but he can set up political situations that sort of entrap the administration into doing his bidding. Now, it hasn't been easy for him because he has done the most outrageous things that he can think of to provoke a violent counter reaction. And what happens is, let's say that he bombs an embassy, let's say he assassinates somebody in the capital of Iran. When Iran responds, the Western media doesn't say, well, Iran responded because this happened, because that happened, and that's what triggered all of this. They just start from today and they say, look at this, we suddenly have an attack by Iran. And sort of like they're these wild-eyed monsters who just out of the blue decide we don't like Israel, we're going to attack them. And of course, that's the farthest thing from the truth. Iran is quite anxious to avoid a direct conflict with Israel. They may not like them, and they may have sort of a Cold War going with Israel, but the whole all of this political maneuvering you see is Netanyahu leading Israel to take actions that will provoke a sudden harsh reaction from the Arab states, particularly from, well, not Arab, Iran is not an Arab state, but particularly from Iran, and trigger something that compels the President of the United States to authorize American troops to join the battle on the side of Israel. And he hasn't succeeded yet, but he will not stop trying until his dying day, or at least until he's out of office. So we can expect that there will be this continuing push for war, and it's really going to be up to whoever is the president at the time to try to draw back and try to avoid being entrapped by Netanyahu into a situation where the American public is clamoring for war. We got to get even with this one or that one, and hopefully level heads can prevail, and we can avoid being suckered into a war that does nothing but hurt the United States. It does absolutely nothing for the United States to become engaged in a war with Iran or with Ukraine. With so many of these wars are very counterproductive for the American people. Now, there are elites who become enormously wealthy off of this blood money, but it never hurts. It never helps the American citizen on the streets.
When we look at the conflict in Ukraine, before this conflict started, there was a huge miscalculation on the part of the West that they thought by tremendous sanctions on Russia, by the war in Ukraine, they would weaken Russia, which wasn't the case so far after more than 2 years of this conflict. It seems that the same kind of mindset right now exists in Israel. They think that they can destroy Iran. Netanyahu was talking with people of Iran recently. He said that we're going to support you, we're going to overthrow the government, and you're going to be free. And in your opinion, the same kind, if you remember, the same kind of mindset when the conflict in Ukraine started, they said, Putin is Hitler, we're going to help Russians, you're going to be free. And when we put these two rhetorics together right now with two attacks, Iranian attack, which wasn't the case before October 7th, they were never, they have been we haven't seen anything, any direct conflict between Iran and Israel before October 7th. Right now, Iran attacked Israel 2 times after those assassinations, and one attack on Iranian consulate, and then the assassination of the political head of Hamas in Iran. What have we learned from the Iranian capabilities so far, and which it doesn't seem that the Israeli government understand it?
It's been the policy of Israel to go to war with Iran for many years. And it's just a question of when the opportunity presents itself. I was asked the question just today what I thought about the ability of Iran to withstand an attack and what type of attack it might be if it were launched. Now, Iran has known for a long time that its nuclear program is a target. It's a war target. And they've had a lot of time to prepare. I would have to believe that that some of their best capabilities are very deeply embedded in granite mountains that have been tunneled out, much as other nations have used underground tunnels to harden particular defensive sites. I would think that would be the case, and if that is the case, I recall there used to be a bunker busting bomb. It was a 10,000-pound bomb, as far as I know, the largest in the inventory. And it was designed to attack sites such as the underground nuclear facilities. And I have to question whether that kind of conventional munition is capable of penetrating the defensive preparations of Iran. I don't know, but I think there is a very disturbing possibility that it is not sufficient, and that any attack on Iran would require the use of nuclear missiles or nuclear weapons, not necessarily missiles, but probably some sort of tactical nuclear weapon that could be used to pierce underground fortifications. And so the problem is, anytime that any nation unleashes nuclear power, there are just too many nuclear weapons around in the hands of various countries, but particularly the United States and Russia. And the concern about escalation it's really a monumental challenge for humankind. It's not just a we versus them type of thing, but if any country, if Russia were to use a nuclear weapon, that would be enormously destabilizing. And if we were to do it, or if we were to allow Ukraine, if we would provide them with some sort of a nuclear weapon and they used it, just the dominoes can start falling very quickly, and these things start flashing back and forth, and the next thing, you have 60% of all of the people on Earth lying dead. And it could happen in a period of weeks rather than years. So the risk and the uncertainty of an attack on Iran are just enormous. Iran doesn't want they don't want a war right at this moment. I don't think the United States wants a war, but Israel badly wants a war, and they're fine. It doesn't matter what it is. Israel, of course, is a very major nuclear power, uh, sort of in the category of China. Uh, China doesn't have nearly what we or Russia have, but they're a significant power. And so they're sort of the next echelon down. If we're the first class nuclear power, then China and Israel are the second class nuclear powers. So uh, Israel seems to be willing to risk whatever risk there might be from a confrontation with Iran, but it's in the interest of all the civilized world to prevent a war from breaking out.
Right now, do you find it that, in your opinion, the Biden administration is trying to do its best to bring the tensions down between Iran and Israel, or it doesn't matter what they're trying to do, Israel is not going to listen to them?
The the Biden administration is in the difficult position where they have Muslim American voters who are very concerned about what is happening over in the Middle East. Interestingly, you have a surprisingly large number of Jewish Americans who agree with the Muslims, the Muslim Americans. I was quite surprised by this, that probably the biggest demonstrations organized in Washington, D.C. against the Israeli war with Gaza were organized by Jewish leaders rather than Muslim leaders. So, but the Biden administration finds itself in this very awkward position where they have the Jewish American vote, very important in Michigan and a couple of other places, and they can't ignore them, because if they completely ignore them, they're going to lose the election. On the other hand, they have this enormous power of the pro-Israeli groups that that provides the funding for the political campaign. So you have this weird situation where the Biden administration is providing these 2,000-pound bombs, which are the principal instrument with which to destroy all of the infrastructure that supports life in the Gaza Strip. I understand that when we killed the head of Hezbollah, we used 84 2,000-pound bombs to do it. We provided all of this and all the intelligence. And so you have the United States very deeply complicit in the attack on Lebanon. And at the same time, you had this odd thing that broke out between Republicans and Democrats, where Kamala Harris, she made what she thought was kind of an innocent throwaway to the Muslim Americans. She said, "Well, look, we're providing $176 million to Lebanon because their people have been displaced and that kind of thing." And right away, the Republicans jumped on it and said, "Hey, why are you sending our money overseas when we can use it for hurricane relief?" So you just have this horrible dynamic where the Democrats are truly boxed in. They're trying to help both sides of the same war, and the Republicans are trying to get more of the money that comes from these big donors, and they're trying to ratchet things up so that they look more pro-Israel than the Democrats. It's terribly unhealthy, and the one group that does not benefit at all in any respect is the American people. They do not gain in the slightest. All that they stand nothing but to lose. If some huge war breaks out, we lose. If a more modest war breaks out, like the war against Hezbollah, which is going to potentially be a disaster for Israel, by the way, whatever happens, we have to pay the bills. We're losing respect around the world by all of this. In the distance, it may threaten the dollar. The fact that we're losing respect from these countries, so it's quite a dilemma that's faced by the United States. I'm sorry, I'm not hearing you right now.
Can you hear me right now?
Yes, you're fine.
Yeah. With the situation with Russia right now in Ukraine, yesterday Lavrov was talking about that they're watching what the United States is doing in Ukraine because they're so concerned about the United States sending long-range missiles to Ukraine. And
I'm sorry, I'm losing your video now also. Can you hear me? I've lost your audio and your video. You just have a freeze frame right at this moment. Let me just continue, and perhaps you'll come back here in a moment. The situation that where things are in Ukraine right now is that the Russians have mobilized very substantial military forces, and they greatly outnumber the Ukrainians on the battlefield. Ukraine is very much on the defensive. They launched sort of a big PR attack into Russia in the area of Kursk, which is really a remote kind of a farming area, very thinly populated, and the Ukrainians, knowing that the importance of the American elections, that they've got to hang on and keep fighting until November 5th at least. And so they launched this attack. They drew a lot of forces from the major battle effort down in the Donetsk province or oblast. And they withdrew those and they sent them up for this PR stunt up in Kursk. It's been disastrous, and I think when the history is written of the Ukrainian war, one of the great debacles will be the battle for Kursk, which sent some of Ukraine's finest, most effective troops, sent them up to attack some emptiness, some fields and a handful of tiny little settlements that were scarcely populated. And in exchange, they drew away critically slender defenses in many areas. And as a result, just within the last week or 10 days, the fortress at Ugladar collapsed and was overrun. Now, when I say fortress, I'm not talking about a castle type of thing, but it was elevated ground that dominated the whole area. Where from Ugladar, the Ukrainians could look out and they could launch artillery attacks, and they could just see what was going on from every direction. And so that has collapsed, which now is one really vital element of the defensive lines that has just simply disappeared. And this is happening all over. The Ukrainians are losing the war. They've fought very valiantly. I mean, no one can criticize them. They've been very heroic and very effective, but they're outnumbered, they're outgunned, their economy is a wreck, and they're becoming a nation of widows and orphans, all for nothing, because both Russia and Ukraine had worked out a peace agreement 2 months after Russia first entered the war. There were scarcely any casualties or any damage at the time, and both parties would have been very happy with the agreement. But NATO, the White House decided, no, we want some blood. We want to see Russia brought down. And as a consequence, fantastic numbers of people have been killed in Ukraine, and the country's been depopulated. And Russia, they've lost substantial numbers of people too, but they've got a much bigger population. They can absorb it, and their economy has been remarkably resilient. No one would have predicted that Russia could have achieved the economic miracle they have pulled off during this war. Because if anything, they're perhaps more economically powerful and stable than they were before the war.
And when we look at the bigger picture of what's going on right now in Ukraine, in the Middle East, or maybe in Taiwan, do you think that we are losing our ability to talk with each other? Because the way that we've been witnessing in Ukraine, and right now in the Middle East, we know that Iran, as you mentioned, Iran and the United States are not interested in having any sort of direct conflict, direct war in the Middle East. And we know that Russia and the United States are not interested in fighting each other. And we can say that the war in Ukraine is a proxy war, but it's not a direct war between the United States and Russia. Do you think that in Washington they're losing their ability to talk, to talk? The simple thing would be to talk to each other, and you may find some sort of compromise and cooperation, and put these differences aside for a moment.
Well, I don't think there would be any difficulty at all in coming up with resolutions to some of these things. Now, the Israeli situation is different because, like we talked about, that's a tail wagging the dog situation, and it's a terrible dilemma for whichever party happens to be in power. Ukraine was a different thing entirely. We set about overthrowing the government of Ukraine. This was done under Barack Obama in 2014. And the idea was that we would then funnel in vast amounts of arms, and we would build up a powerful Ukrainian army to attack the Russian-speaking areas, and ultimately, perhaps, to attack Russia itself, and which has happened now up in Kursk. We didn't intend to work things out with Russia. we didn't intend to say, let's do what's reasonable. We intended to create conditions that would force Russia into battle. Russia, President Putin, Ambassador Lavrov, they struggled desperately to avoid being boxed into war. And they, they pushed for the Minsk agreements to settle the ongoing war in the two breakaway areas, the three areas of Ukraine that were Russian speaking, that decided that the conditions, the revolutionary junta that was installed in 2014 was so harshly against Russian speaking people that it just made them sort of an underclass. And they had every reason to declare their independence because the government in Kiev hated their guts and wanted to exterminate them. So these things could have been resolved, but for the fact that there is a long-standing movement to drive NATO further and further to the east and eventually to somehow, I think, conquer and dismember Russia. And the irony of it is that, we're also trying to we're in this power struggle with China, and one of the outgrowths of this war in Ukraine is that we may see a very close alliance between China and Russia for the long run that sort of unites this vast swath of Europe and Asia and creates this land bridge that that was always feared by the British back in the 1800s, where they always worried that at some point you'd have all of these areas of Eastern Europe and Asia that would somehow unite, not become one nation, but become political allies that would be so big and powerful that it could overwhelm the rest of Europe. We have been encouraging this by what we've done. The Russians historically have not been natural allies of China. But, when we have launched this enormous attack, and we've early on, we were talking openly about overthrowing President Putin and how, maybe we could prompt some people to rise up and to go in and kill him. I mean, it was just all kinds of crazy, loose claims. And so Russia has gradually closed its doors on the West and opened its doors to the East. And in terms of the people who think in terms of power politics and that kind of thing, you have two enormous power players in the world. You have the United States and you have China. And then you have a smaller power center, not geographically smaller, but in terms of population, wealth, and so forth. And that's China. Or I'm sorry, that's Russia. Well, whichever side is teamed up with Russia is going to be more dominant. And the United States had the opportunity to open doors with Russia. Russia has fantastic natural resources. There's no country on earth that possesses their wealth of natural resources. And in addition to a lot of human capital and skills. But it was Russia working together with Germany by providing natural gas at a very cheap price that made Germany an economic powerhouse. Because the thing that powers Germany is the chemical industry. It is at the top, at the pinnacle of the German economy. And from cheap chemicals and enormous chemical profits, it flows down to every industry in Germany, making it competitive, making it powerful. And that in turn helps all of Europe and makes Europe powerful. And I think we had every reason in the world to incorporate Russia into this relationship and to make them part and parcel. Russia wanted to be part of NATO. Russia wanted to be, closer to the European Union. They wanted to foster trade back and forth. They were tired with the idea, the old Bolshevik idea of empire. It didn't work out for them. It was crummy. They wanted nothing to do with it. And so if we had been smart, if we had been wise, we would have said, let's bring Russia into the fold. Let's make them part of our way of life. And that way, for the power people who think in terms of balance of power, we'd be dominant over China with all of their resources and human power. We would still be the dominant power. But we've just forfeited that because short-sighted people decided that they could pull off a war against Russia and they could potentially either weaken it or dismantle it, dismember the whole country. And it hasn't worked. It's been a disaster. And I think anybody who is realistic behind closed doors is saying it's just a matter of time before this thing collapses. And how can we salvage something out of it?
Yeah. Thank you, Senator, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always, talking to you.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed being with you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.